Welcome to Forging Plowshares, a community dedicated to cultivating the peaceful kingdom of God. We hope this part of our ongoing conversation stimulates your mind and challenges your heart about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Please stay tuned at the end of the podcast for a short message about our ministry.
This is Paul Axton, Director of Forging Plowshares and Plowshares Bible Institute. And in this podcast, we do something a little different. The subject of sin is complicated enough that Brad and I then do a discussion about my recent blog and then the sermon based on that blog, which I attach then after the discussion. It may need the background of this discussion to understand the idea that sin is not connected to a legal context or to guilt in some sort of automatic judicial sense that we have. And in fact, quite the opposite is true, and that we're missing then the biblical portrayal of sin. Our conversation, I think, will bring it out, and then hopefully this will add a depth and layer to the sermon. Plowshares provides one of the most in-depth seminary educations available, and we need your help. We offer classes with world-class scholars, such as Anthony Bartlett, which is coming up in September. We're very excited about this class. I think Anthony Bartlett is one of the premier Girardian scholars and has taken Girard further than Girard himself, that there's a ministerial and real depth to Bartlett. But we offer these classes at a rate that everyone can afford without the debt. And we then publish many of these classes on our podcast so that everyone can benefit from the rigorous theology that we feel is part of understanding the fullness of Jesus' love. That is, that good theology heals us, it helps us to live out the good news. So if you're able, we certainly appreciate your donations. You can donate through Outreach International, OI Online, through PayPal or Simple Give. Just choose our project number, FP 3901. And your donations given through Outreach are completely tax deductible. We depend upon your donations and certainly appreciate them. But I hope you benefit then from this extended conversation on the definition of sin.
So, Paul, I wanted to try out an interview format for your blog post because with severe ADHD, sometimes I look and I'm like, that's really interesting. Boy, that's a lot to get through. And as an introduction to your preaching, in which you kind of do your blog posts, I thought I would be the student. I was going to say play the student, but that would act like I already know it, and I don't. So your latest blog post was on sin, which I was really interested in because Jordan Daniel Wood, my favorite thing that I've ever heard in my life in terms of preaching is Jordan Daniel Wood has a thing called Maximus the Confessor's View of Sin on some YouTube channel. There's a 20-minute cut on it. And I send it to everybody and they're like, oh my gosh, this is fantastic. And his view of sin is that sin is something in which we really just misunderstand who we are and who God is. And if we really understood who we are and who God is, we would do the right thing. And he goes into, like, somebody says, well, I know this is wrong, but I'm doing it anyway. He's like, well, then you don't really know the good, because you would choose the good if it were there. And I couldn't recommend that 20-minute piece enough. So let's see if you can teach us what you are engaging with this view of sin so that we might benefit from your blog post. So tell me about your blog post here, this view of sin.
Okay, well, I appreciate your gentle way of telling me my writing is incomprehensible, but
No. This is a confession of my own ADHD.
But I appreciate that. No, what I did, and maybe this is a discovery. You know, when I've heard the definition of hamartia, of sin as missing the mark, I've tended to be dismissive of a kind of etymological, and I took it to be a purely etymological approach. And I think it's actually more serious and more important than that. And so this was a kind of a new understanding that I tied in a lot of the work that I've done is in fact in the area of Paul's definition of sin, understanding of sin. But once you do Paul, of course, Paul is talking about an Old Testament understanding. So it's the development of that understanding in Genesis 3. And so beginning with just the idea of hamartia.
Well, hold on. Can you just take us through quickly, since you've written a lot on it extemporaneously, Paul's explication of the Old Testament view of sin, so that we can tag along?
So what Paul is doing, in one of the key passages in Romans 7 in particular, he's doing a commentary on Genesis chapter 3. That's pretty much the accepted understanding. So that you have sin, deceived me. Deceived me about what? Well, deceived me in regard to the command or the law. And so he's going through, and it should be pointed out that in Genesis, when Adam partakes of the fruit and then for the first time he speaks, it is the first time in Scripture in Genesis that the word I appears. And then in one sentence, he repeats the word 4 times. I ran, I hid, I was afraid, I was naked. In other words, the first words out of his mouth are this understanding that there's clearly is a new self-conceptualization, that suddenly the nakedness, the ashamedness that is there in Genesis is very much connected to this discovery. I don't know if discovery is the right word, but this falling into this egotistical capture by the term I, and I just translates, the Greek word is just ego, where we get our ego. And so when Paul is doing his commentary, which is the way I'm taking it, he also then repeats in a fashion that he does not do elsewhere. He uses the word I in this peculiar fashion that Adam uses the word. The embarrassment, the shame, connecting the I to a duality. I do what I don't want to do. In other words, he's repeating the word in the same way that Adam repeated it. Reflecting then this duality he's going through, he's reflecting the psychology, the failure of the self that is captured in this egotistical understanding. So that's a bit of the background to what Paul is doing, a kind of psychology. That's not all that he does with sin, but that's one of the things that he does with sin that is reflective of what is taking place in Genesis. And so at first I didn't understand how what I just said lines up with sin in hamartia as missing the mark. Okay, so when you come to hamartia, I think that our natural inclination is to understand missing the mark in a judicial or legal sense. But that's exactly wrong. In other words, I think all of our instincts are exactly wrong in our understanding of sin, because maybe it's just the training that we've all been to, or maybe it's just the sensibility that we have, that we immediately relate sin and guilt and the law. In other words, we put them in conjunction with one another. And so I think that I was guilty of doing the same thing. Well, first of all, in the Hebrew understanding, that there is no one word that is captured that is translated sin from the Hebrew. So that part of the problem is going from the Hebrew text to the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament. And so what happens in the Greek is that everything in the Hebrew is reduced to hamartia, is reduced to missing the mark. And so if we put a judicial understanding, a guilt understanding to hamartia, well, we're actually doing a cover up of all of that rich Hebrew text. And what is there in the Hebrew is, a variety of terms that may be referring to losing your way, to being bent, or it may or may not carry any culpability. In fact, in sometimes it specifically does not have the sense of culpability. So that to equate sin and guilt is already missing that in the Hebrew. To say that sin is something that you're culpable for, well, that's not true. That's not true of the Hebrew, and it does not capture the richness of the terms. So that's a minor point, and that is that in the Hebrew, you cannot automatically assume that the context for sin, first of all, pertains to guilt or to being culpable, nor does it necessarily pertain either to a theological context or a secular or civil, law context. You
Let,
just
let
have,
me let me try to put this in terms that I once heard. I have brilliant children, and one of them was articulating for me this amazing Christian ethic, and she was like 11, and her psychiatrist, who said to me, that daughter has articulated something amazing, but she is still functioning at the level of avoid punishment and seek reward, no matter what she articulates. And I wonder if a parental view of this, like, well, how do we approach our children when they do something wrong? Are we sitting there trying to say, well, you've broken a rule? Or are we trying to say, hey, I want to show you a better way. You misunderstand something. Is that like a fair kind of angle to take on where this might be going?
well, yeah, maybe that fear and punishment may be instinctual, but there is also another element to it. In other words, once you do fear and punishment, you're doing, in a sense, you're talking about legal transgression, so that the view of the parent may be as, some sort of enforcer. But the other aspect to it is that in the Hebrew, of course, and this comes out in the story in Genesis, that the serpent, and we're never quite sure of, what this serpent is. It comes up out of the earth, and but then you read the next story involving Cain and Abel, and there is no serpent, but the word that is used there, sin, is still doing all the work of the serpent. That even in God's explanation, that sin desires, that sin is this animate force that is deceiving you. And that's what Paul is doing in Romans 7. That is, he does not refer to the devil or the serpent or to diablos, but he just refers to the word sin. But he's also then talking about sin as this animate force, that sin deceived me in regard to the law. And he begins to, if you go through Romans 7, he's doing what God, the voice and the voice of God, is, identified there in the story of Cain. And that in the Hebrew, then, there is the word diablos. There's a lot of words for devil, but it's not necessarily, we immediately attach a kind of personage to that. But diablos, adversary, is not a personage, uh, but in fact is just this power or this force. And you can't even say that it's necessarily evil. In other words, because even God sends an angel to Balaam, and it's called, the adversary, the same word for that angel. But in this instance, it's directly from. So the point is that this thing that we call sin it is deceptive. It's very much linked to human desire. And that's what God says about sin to Cain, that sin desires, you in some way. And that's obviously there in the story of Eve, that she sees the tree as desirable, good for eating, desirable to make you wise. And so what is left out of missing the mark is this dynamism of deception and desire that is there. It's very much there in the Hebrew context that I'm afraid we may lose in, first of all, by bringing it simply into a judicial understanding. So actually main thing about sin is not the legal aspect, but it's this deceptive desire that captures us and then obscures. In other words, what is happening in the case of Adam and Eve is, well, the tree of life, which, whatever you believe about that story, is representative of God's presence. And they get captured not by, their focus is not on the presence of God. In fact, they're going to lose that presence. They're cast out of the garden. The tree, is taken out. That they no longer have access, this direct access. Same thing with Cain. What is it that he has his focus upon? Well, on his brother Abel, because Abel finds favor with God, and so he wants to gain that favor. But his focus is by killing Abel, he can obtain the favor. Once you get this, and of course, part of this, I don't bring this out in either the sermon or the blog, but it's it's a sense that Girard discovers in mimetic desire, that the obstacle becomes the focus, and we lose track of, even, in the various illustrations in Girard, you lose track of what the two knights in armor may be fighting over. The lady in waiting that they may be dueling over becomes inconsequential because they become completely focused on the obstacle. And so this is the stories, that get repeated again and again, that with Cain, his focus is on Abel. And then you go to the story of Lamech, and Lamech actually focuses then on his enemies, the two. We can't say how, he's killed some people, either one person or two persons. But he says that if Cain would be avenged 7 times, then Lamech, I'll do my own avenging. And so the focus becomes on his enemies. And then the next in the story, of course, is the generation of Noah. So
I want to pause for a second, because I want to bring people along, because I want to try to summarize what you said and see if I understand. This is called Check for Understanding from my teacher days. So we see first a relationship with God in Genesis, and then we see a desire for something else. That shift in desire then shifts to it's about me and what I want. And there is then a shift in focus, almost like you're looking at God. This is the king's garden they have, and this is taken from earlier myths. You're looking at God, you're walking around the garden. Suddenly you shift from looking at God to looking at something else. And Adam and Eve then break apart that relationship between each other and God, and their shift is towards an object. And then really the shift is away from God towards an object. Is that a fair shifting of desire?
We lost the target. In other words, if sin is missing the mark, it's not in a judicial sense, like, you're shooting an arrow and you just slightly miss the bullseye. No, the point is you can't even see the target. The target is completely obscured. There's an obstacle in the way. And that's the sense of missing the mark. So that's step one. And I found that significant, especially then when you come to the New Testament summation of the problem. What is the human predicament? What is the human problem? In the New Testament, in Paul, but not just Paul, the law is the obstacle. In other words, we often, if we put sin in the context of the law, then the danger is that we're going to picture the law as an end in itself. Well, that's the problem. That's not the solution. And that's the way that, Paul says, well, the law came that sin might increase. That there's
So,
an
so to pause for a second. So most of my background in trying to preach this was when I was doing youth ministry was, well, Adam and Eve shifted. They wanted to be God. I think most people, the way that they tell the Christian story is people have broken a rule. God says, hey, follow this rule. You've broken the rule. And Jesus comes to teach us not to break the rules. And we get a second chance at following the rules, which is a kind of recapitulation of the very problem Paul was talking about. He's like, this is not about the rules, people. This is about desiring the wrong thing. You don't know God. And if you're following the rules, just like all of us, I wish I could prevent my past self from doing this and my children's future from doing this. All of us try to work out a series of rules to live by. And then at some point, we're blessed with a complete crash that whatever rules we chose to try to live by, they don't really work because the focus shouldn't have been on the rules. Is that a fair gloss?
that is, and actually this makes Christianity very simple. And what I'm saying, the wrong understanding. Oh, what is our problem? God gave us a rule, we broke the rule, and we're guilty, and Jesus takes care of our guilt problem. That's the way we usually tell the story. I think that what that form of Christianity is doing is actually accentuating the problem because the focus is still on, as you're saying, the law, the rule, and Jesus is just subsumed into that definition of the problem. Whatever it's a guilt problem. Jesus bears the guilt for us, and God punishes him. And so we've missed the point of Jesus Christ. We've actually missed the point of the law. And this is what Paul keeps trying to tell people, that the law doesn't contain God. The law does not contain life. The law is not the presence of God. The law is not the target. And where you make the law the target, you're going to do to Jesus Christ what the people of the law did to him. The scribes and the Pharisees, when they encounter Jesus in Matthew and Luke, he says to them, you're going to do what your fathers have done in killing the prophets. You're plotting to kill me, in the course of the conversation. They say, no, that if we had existed, at the time of our fathers, we would not have killed the prophets. And so they build the tombs of the prophets, honoring the prophets, but missing the fact that they are carrying on the murderous desire of their forefathers in building the tombs. They ignore the reality that is confronting them in Jesus Christ, who is the very image of God, who is then the target, who is, the very purpose of the law, not the, it's not that he's subject to the law. And so they begin to plot at that very moment how they're going to murder Jesus. And Jesus says that I have revealed to you the history of murder from, the blood of Abel to the blood of Berechiah. The history of murder in the Hebrew Bible, the history of murder in the world is laid at your feet. that previously people were not culpable for their sin because they didn't understand. This is said, repeated many times. But Jesus says, if I had not come, you would not be culpable. But now you are, because I've revealed to you the reality. And so he lays the blood, this is not anti-Semitism. This is just anti-sin. That is, that the Pharisees, the scribes, these are probably the best, the finest representatives of the human race in their understanding of the law. But what the best of people would do when they meet Jesus is kill him. And so the exposure of sin in the scribes and Pharisees is an example, and that's the point, that here is the exposure of the human murderous orientation, this violent orientation, that no longer can we claim ignorance. And of course, that's the very nature of sin, because here the son himself, in the story of the vineyard, the owner of the vineyard sends the servants and then finally sends his own son, and they kill the son, imagining that they can take ownership. Well, that's the very thing that's happening.
So I want to try to take this to, like, say me or somebody listening. So I began life and I was like, man, I want to be a good person. I got to figure out what the church teaches and follow those rules. And like the way that in the Catholic Church, like if you break a rule, you might have committed a mortal sin. If you knew it and you knew the consequences, and then you broke it anyway. And so then you go to confession. You confess that you've hurt someone or broken the rule, and then you're back with God. But it's still very much about weighing things against a series of rules and measuring my life against how good I am doing against the rules, or even in some ways, how good I am doing in treating in people. And so where I'm missing the mark is that what I really need to be doing, and tell me if I get this right, is, almost in a contemplative tradition, I need to be spending time soaking in God such that I can recognize where in the heck God is and be with God. And that takes, I would say, contemplative prayer, not just thinking prayer, but just time soaking in God and being around people who are doing that. Is that sort of, where am I in that? Because I'm trying to make, if Jesus is saying that this is what you guys did, it's what we did. So I'm trying to see if I've got this right.
Well, I think, in other words, you're still describing the problem that I think we need to go further in understanding what the nature of the problem is. And that is that if once we miss the mark, what is taking place is the mark, the model for us, is what's gone missing. The way that we're fully human is in relation, certainly a right relation with God that brings us into a right relationship with other people. And so if you look at the two, the creation account, that in the beginning, man with the couple were created in the image of God. Then you go to chapter 5 and it talks about the offspring of Adam, and that it says that they are in his likeness and image. The model changes. The one that we would imitate changes, and it becomes a frustrating impossibility. Cain cannot become Abel by killing him. Adam and Eve cannot become divine through this magic, this knowledge, or, whatever that. In other words, the focus shifts upon other people, ourselves, and so that in this modeling, that it is a desire that is a frustrated desire, because you can never obtain the object of your desire in sin. You can't, Cain can try to consume Abel, he can literally eat him for lunch, but he's not going to take the place of Abel. This is what Eve and Adam, they're consuming and imagining that they're obtaining divinity. This is what's happening with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The thing that is desired, the law, you cannot obtain the object of the law, which is an imagined object, that there is this imagined personage. If you mistake the law for God, you're aiming at the wrong object. It's a frustrated, exponential desire that God says to Cain, this thing's going to consume you. And that's exactly what happens in our frustrated, desire, that we become murderous in our exponential desire.
So like a Christian listening to this, like tell me what like a person who's really trying to be good but not quite getting this, what is like a faithful Christian really getting wrong that's actually shifting from God to something else? Like somebody really trying to be good. How does that look?
Well, I think the thing that we don't want to name is jealousy, envy, rivalry. In other words, if you and I are friends, but then I get to watching you, and I notice you're particularly good. In fact, you're so good, I think I want to be you. There is a sense in which the thing that we all feel, and none of us want to talk about, but is just part of mimetic desire. It's really just a part of growing up. It's just that we imitate other people. But of course, what we're attempting to do, this is why, I don't know how Freudian you want to be, but this is the sense in which Freud gets it right in the Oedipus complex, that we admire our father as our model, but of course, then we become split because we actually want to be the father. I don't know how this is Gerard's point, that he at least got the mimesis right. So what comes with this wrong-headed pursuit are these common feelings that we just all grow up with, and none of us will admit to because it's sort of shameful, that we lock on to other people and we become jealous of them because they seem to have a substance, or they seem to have obtained life or have being. And I feel by their fullness my own lack. As long as we're bent upon being good, keeping the law, and I'm afraid this is what happens in the typical church experience, maybe because of this theological understanding, we just can't own up to the feelings that we're passing through and need to get beyond of jealousy, envy, rivalry, these things that are just common to the human race. But if we're captured by that, if we live out our life in that mode of ambition and desire, we're actually always going to live a kind of frustrated life that falls short of the peace of God. And so I think we have to, first of all, own up to the fact of these feelings, but also then what is taking place in Christ? What is taking place in following Christ is that once you get the image.
I want to pause for a second on the feelings thing, because I think this is important, and I think that it's going to help us to get to your next point. I remember Jordan Daniel Wood, the guy who I'm jealous of. I'd love to be that brilliant. He said, if your feelings are the best indication of the actual map you have of reality. Like when something happens to you and you have a feeling, that tells you what you actually think about reality, because the feeling tells you the picture that you have. You might tell yourself, oh, I'm this kind of person, this kind of person, this kind of person. But when the feelings of jealousy or rage or anger or those things comes up, that tells you what you actually really expect you're owed in reality. That tells you the mental picture that you have. So you're not guilty for having feelings. Your feelings reveal that you're desiring the wrong thing, And when you have that, you shouldn't be like, well, I shouldn't have that feeling. You should be like, well, maybe I'm after the wrong thing. Is that fair?
That's great. Yeah, that's it. Because in other words, first of all, what we've done in reducing sin to a legal realm, we've actually left out the whole emotional, personal aspect that we're discussing now, that is very much present in the Bible, but we never talk about that. We don't know what to do with shame. We know what to do with guilt. Oh, that's easy because Jesus paid the price. But we don't know what to do with shame and all of the negative feelings that accompany shame. The feeling of nakedness. That's not just a description of I don't have any clothes, but in fact that the reality of what I am is being exposed. And we cannot bear shame. We literally cannot live naked, that exposed in that fashion, because we're all such, we're consumed by things that are actually, it's almost trivial in a sense what consumes us. And so yes,
So,
I
so
think
in other words, if I'm sitting there and I'm noticing a feeling of anger or jealousy or those things, it's terrifying because I don't want to admit to myself that feeling because it emits those desires. And I know at some level, like, well, that's not something I'd want people to know. I wouldn't want, each person who I admire to know that I'm like a little bit jealous of their abilities because, well, that's petty. And like not wanting to feel petty is another way to say I have shame. I don't want to feel like this is a part of what's going on in me. I don't know what to do with that. So I try to ignore it or pass it off or just be like, well, that's just a feeling, instead of taking it as a barometer for like, oh, Jesus, please heal me of this misfocus. Not that I'm like thinking you're looking down on me, Jesus, but like, oh, I'm not really after the right thing. Like help me to desire you. And to do that, I need to spend more time in prayer and to like spend more time around other Christians and, confess our sins to one another, bring it out into the open, be like, man, I'm struggling with this. Because I remember one time the first time I called you, and I said, well, I'm really struggling with this. And you're like, I struggle with this too. And that like pierces the shame by saying we all have these things going on. And then once we can realize that we're all in this together of having these things going on, we could then turn to Jesus and each other to like ask for a shift in desire and focus. Is that fair?
that's it. That's it. In other words, that as long as we're in this state of sin, we really can't accept the good gifts that God gives us through other people. Because when we see these gifted people, rather than accepting God's grace as it comes to us, we would rather like to be the source of the grace rather than to receive the grace. And so people's gifts are given for other people. But what we would like to do is own them, is obtain them. And so once we learn to love other people, then we can accept their giftedness and receive that giftedness for what it's meant for. This is the work of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is this community of believers in which we actually learn to enjoy other people. We learn to enjoy their graces and their gifts, and we don't need to own it. Because under sin, if I see someone that's particularly gifted, I always like Zizek's illustration of this. He just talks about Alenka Zupančič, her book. He says, it's such a brilliant book that I wish she had been run over by a truck. In other words, he's saying, I wish I had done this. Well, what he's owning up to is the common feeling that we all have when we encounter that somebody seems to be more substantial. And by the way, everybody seems more substantial, to some of us this is the, child psychology. A little child doesn't feel like they're holding together very well. And you look at other people and they seem to cohere and hold together. And I wish I could hold together in the way that these people do. And so our instinct is one of aggressive violence that is, conk Abel over the head with the rock, and maybe I can get his stuff. Or if I can eliminate him, maybe this favor of God will fall upon me. Well, of course, the idea is that, no, Abel was a gift to Cain, and he should have received him that way. Joseph and his brothers, Joseph may be a little irritating to his brothers, but what they would do is kill him. And they're forced then ultimately to receive the gifts of God through their brother Joseph. And the ultimate story is, of course, the story of Christ. And I think that here, we can kind of, that we get it, that Christ has poured out himself. This is the picture of kenotic love. The gift of God to us is one that we receive because God has poured himself out for us and to us. And once we can take up our cross, then we're no longer bound by these petty rivalries, jealousy, envy, and shame. I think really shame is the root negative emotion behind all of this. We need an identity. We need to at least appear to cohere. And pride, then, I think the pride shame axis gets at this, but you've got to explain it. That pride comes before shame, in the wisdom literature, because the pride is always going to come undone and shame is going to expose the reality. And so what we're brought to in Jesus Christ, it's the story of the prodigal son, that he is focused on his father's wealth and would obtain the inheritance. And instead of focusing on the father, but he has to go squander the inheritance before he can be returned to his father's love. The older brother in that story is focused on the brother. In other words, they're both in a sibling rivalry, and maybe that's the typical case in which we all encounter rivalries. But then they become focused. They can receive the love and grace of the Father, who in the story is obviously representative of God.
So I'm thinking here of Richard Rohr. He says life is order, disorder, reorder. That all of us, as part of the growth process, that we literally have to go from Saul to Paul. First, we're trying to be like other people. We're trying to achieve in our realm. And Richard Rohr says that churches are the worst ones because people are trying to achieve being the most good. And that is like the most difficult rivalry, because you're not, if you're competing after money, you might even cooperate with people. But if you're competing after the most good, you start to have to point out other people's flaws in order to make sure that you look the most good. And so in some ways, being a religious Christian is one of the most dangerous paths to missing Jesus, because we're trying so hard to look good, to be good, to think of ourselves as good, that we're deeply threatened when we realize it's not really working out, and we quick cover that up. And so the solution is, if I'm really loved by another person, like really they just love the crap out of me, that I'm experiencing Jesus, and they know that I'm doing these things. Like, I know you're doing these things and I still love you. That experience from another person who is literally Christ, because we're being divinized, can be healing for us if we can trust in Jesus's willing acceptance of our misdesire and of our murder. And he's like, I know you're doing this. I'm going to enter. I'm going to let you murder me because I want to show you my love. And I'm not revealing your murderousness, your misshapen desires to put you to shame. I'm doing them to heal you. Is that yeah? Is
That's
that
right.
all right?
We can become human. And of course, what we are prior to that, and I think it's right. This is kind of why I appreciate the Eastern sensibility. That what we're describing is really just a maturing process. And I think that's what Richard Rohr may be pointing to. that we all kind of begin as little creatures, you know. We have to pass through various stages. I think that's a way of reading the story of Adam and Eve. It's not that there is necessarily guilt in that. It's just the human condition. Now, there may be guilt, and that may, but I think the deeper problem is the problem of shame. And this psychologically is just being reappreciated. It's not actually there in Freud. Freud, he's describing this root negative emotion that is actually, I think, picked up in a, it's still not, the word is not there in Lacan and Zizek, but it's very much there in the Bible. And shame is kind of this, it's an emotion, it's this experience, but it's also this worldview that comes with shame. And so I think what we're doing in this understanding is reintroducing the emotional life and giving an account of the genealogy of our emotions that is very much there in the Bible. This is, the whole thing is accounting for the wholeness of our humanity. And unfortunately, in our stunted legalistic theology, we leave out this wholeness, and we imagine that what it means to be human can be reduced to legal categories. And that's the problem. That's not the solution.
So I have a friend who is an alcoholic, and he entered AA and the Catholic Church. He entered the Catholic Church through AA, and then he still was drinking. He was hiding it. And he said, I've been sober for, I forget the number of years or months now. And he said, there's this guy in AA who says, I'm so grateful to be an alcoholic. And I said to him, I really tried to be a good Catholic. I tried really, really hard. I did adoption. I did foster care, and I made quite a mess. And then I experienced, people didn't think I was so great as I wanted myself to think and other people to think. And I was trying to be good. I really was. But it was the gift of being cast out of my own failure, which I feel like has given me the opportunity to be like, wait, my value is in being loved. And I got to soak that in. And the more that I soak in being loved and nonviolence, the more I can turn to other people who I'm being injured by, slowly, and be like, I accept the injury you're giving me. And I still am going to reflect back love to you, because that's what I hope is happening to me. And as it happens to me, I can do that more. And it's that peaceful, forgiving turn of willing acceptance of other people's injuries and returning the unconditional love that kind of goes between both my trying to soak that in from God, and by giving it back to them. In a way, I'm soaking it in from God by giving the gift that I hope I'm being given. And I'm not perfect at this at all. The whole point is, crashing and burning for an AA person is where we're all actually at. We're all actually crashed and burned. We just don't want to tell ourselves. And that's why in Shusaku Endo's Silence, Ichiro, who keeps betraying the Christians but going back to confession, is perhaps the model of the Christian, the one who's a total mess that everybody's disgusted by, is the only guy who knows he's desiring the wrong things, because these prideful Jesuits are trying to do these great things. Oh, it doesn't work out for them. But the confessing person who knows they're a mess, the AA person who knows they need this community and God, they are actually starting in the right place and the right desire. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I
summary?
think that's it. I've not spent a lot of time at AA. I've met people, and of course, you immediately feel it around people that participate in AA. That feeling of camaraderie that you often get in an AA meeting, that is so often missing in church. Because these people, they've already said, hey, I'm Bob and I'm an alcoholic. They've already exposed the shameful thing. But what we tend to do in church is to cover it up. In other words, we miss the fellowship, we miss the camaraderie, that we're all in this together, because we really don't want people to know what despicable people we are underneath. So yeah, I think that gets at it, that if we can own up to the reality that we all face, and then turn to community and other people, that there is where Christ meets us. And this then is the communion of the saints. This is the Lord's Supper in which Christ has poured himself out for us, and we pour ourselves out for one another. But as long as we're playing the game, as long as we're doing the zero-sum game, and we want to look like we're holding together. And actually, the danger is the better we do that, the greater the danger. The better that the Pharisee is at being a Pharisee, this is Paul's point. I was a Hebrew of Hebrews. I kept the law perfectly. I was blameless in regard to the law, and I am the chief of sinners. The danger is you're successful in your pride, in your law keeping, or whatever your definition of success is. And in your success, you become truly despicable and evil, and you can't own up to the reality.
So basically, if for our listeners, like, hey, if you're discovering that you're a mess, man, you're really on the way. And you see
that's step one.
You see it in the Desert Fathers, where one of my favorite ones is, let's say Abba Moses. Somebody who reads these more closely can tell me. Somebody messes up in their community, and he grabs a bucket of sand with a hole in it, and he's walking. And like, what are you doing walking around with this bucket of sand? And he's like, well, my sins go out before me, behind me, like this sand, because it's blending in with the pathway, of course. And I do not see them. Yet here I go to judge another.
That, in other words, all of our focus is in this mimetic rivalry, and of course we have a stake in the other losing. I mean, if you try to really figure out jealousy and envy, it's really hard to do at some logical level, because it really doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that Cain killed Abel. It doesn't make sense that murder, but murder is the that murderous rivalry, envy, jealousy, that's the course of the world. So you can't make sense of it at one level. But then you introduce this reality and you understand, oh, that's what's driving, that's the driving force behind violence. That's the driving force behind then the cover-up. That may be an individual cover-up that we call pride, my own self-identity, or it may be a corporate cover-up that can come in terms of nationalism. It can even be, I'm afraid that's the way the church functions for many of us, is that just becomes another facade, that becomes another identity that doesn't expose the reality. By not doing the hard work that we're describing here, that unfortunately Christianity can play the role of the law, and that we become the new Pharisees. We become Pharisaical. That can be a way of doing identity through difference, that in some way we imagine elevates us above other people.
That's perfect. I was just talking with a good friend of mine, because I'm Catholic, but I first wanted the security of the church. Well, the church is right, so I can know that I'm right. I'm a part of this group. I'm going to invite people to this group. We're okay. And the shift it's not even a shift. What is happening is I'm trying to feel safe. I'm trying to feel good. I'm trying to do good. But what's missing is Jesus. I mean, like, am I focusing on Jesus, or am I focusing on, I'm a part of this group. This group is right. This group is reliable. And when I discover the kind of foibles of the group, and you see this in the Catholic world so much, like, well, that was their personal sin, but it wasn't this thing. And the group is still reliable. The group is still reliable. Like, the church hasn't been wrong in pronouncing something. And it's this desperate desire for security, for belonging, for being okay, that is just misplaced.
In other words, there's great danger in groups, and it really doesn't matter what the group is, because I almost think it's an impossibility to be in a sick group and to be well. In other words, the infection of the group is a powerful, powerful force. And that's just the nature of corporate mentality, that this thing that, is there in every, I was in academics. It's just red in tooth and claw, even in a Christian institution. It's there in companies. It's there in nationalities and national identities. In other words, yes, we're sick individually, but the reason we're sick individually is that we're sick corporately. And if we try to make ourselves well in and through the values of the group, we just aggravate the sickness, and the better we are at rising to the top in a value system that is sick means that we have become that much more diseased. And so there's great danger in groups. And I don't exclude church groups. They have the same problem. And so to find a real group of, in fellowship, I think that's why AA tends to work so well, because you just start out in that basic truth. And so to find real fellowship it's very difficult, and it's very dangerous to fall in with a group of people, because our tendency is just to absorb the spirit of the group and to be caught up in the zero-sum game that they're always playing.
Yeah, and then I can hear my Catholic background saying, well, everybody's a mess. Good luck finding a place where nobody's a mess. And the rejoinder then is, the phrase that I've just continually found: there are two types of people in this world: those who are a mess and those who don't know it. And I'm really interested in the people who are a mess, because, boy, I have friends who, like, they know they're a mess, and they say, I'm sorry, I really messed that up. And they don't put it on other people. They just own it, and they don't collapse in their I'm a mess. They somehow, I'm thinking of one who's not explicitly a Christian, but they're not collapsing in that they're a mess. There's Christ there. They just aren't able to name Christ. And then, me, who, I just couldn't admit what a mess I was, because otherwise I'm not a good Catholic. So, the more I'm finding I'm breaking the rules and having to go to confession, the bigger the panic, because holy shit, how am I ever going to get to heaven? Because I keep messing up. The cure is to be around people yeah, we are really a mess, and we love each other because Jesus really loves us. I don't know, does that seem? So it's not no groups. It's just be around people who know they're a mess, and that's why AA is such a potentially healthy place.
Yeah, I don't know how to guide people in this, because I do think that at this point, the religion of Christianity has gotten so mixed up with the problem. That's why I don't tend to point people to any denomination or group. I just think you have to negotiate it with the individuals that you may encounter. I do think that, like I preach at a little bitty church, and you're not going to find a lot of, you wouldn't go to the church that I go to gain status in the society. I always think of the Japanese tea room when I go our little bitty church and our little building and the humble people that are there. Everybody that enters the tea ceremony, they all have to bend down. It's a humbling process. You don't go into a tea ceremony uh, with pride in your heart. That's the whole point of it. And I think that many times the church is a kind of it can become such a facade for people. But that's just one of the dangers. And so to find authentic people is very difficult, or people that are like-minded is of great value. And it just may be that you don't find that in church. I don't know. But you can, but it may take some hunting.
I wonder, for myself as I struggle, I just keep trusting, like Illich, the surprise, the other, that I'm no longer able to have the neat, clean divide of you're a Catholic and you're really into this, so we're good. It's more like I'm just looking for where I see authenticity is such a dangerous word because I think it has so much of a background in problematic people. But you're trying to look for people who just are willing to be self-gifting and transparent and know they're a mess and not play pretend and like that may be in the atheist. You don't know who that's going to come into. You gotta be on the lookout for the surprise of Jesus in others.
That's it. Yeah. I was talking to, when I was in Japan, we had a couple, we lived in a city where many scientific researchers came. We had a couple from Nigeria that came, and they were both, I mean, they're brilliant. He is now, like, I think probably the top of his field in the world. He's edited top journals, he's taught in top universities. And yet this couple, they're just humble Christians. But of course, the prejudice and the racism that they have felt in the church, in Australia, unfortunately, but it's same situation. It really doesn't matter who you are or where you're from. You're gonna have to negotiate this thing, and it's gonna be painful. They've just been through so much pain. You think about it, that these world-class intellects that are just treated by Christians as second-class citizens. What they're up against is I think, with them, the facade is quickly exposed of what the people are like. For some of us, we don't have, we may be lured into these groups and not understand what is at the heart of it. And so to have it exposed in that raw kind of way that is there in racism, in nationalism, is a very painful thing. But in a sense, it's what has to be exposed about situations and groups, whatever, if it's an institution. And we're in a time in which the cruelty being exercised by so-called Christians is to deadly extremes. And so carrying the name Christian or Christ is in no way some sort of recommendation of a group or a person.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I was talking with a friend, and I think that if you start discovering stuff about yourself that's humiliating, or about your group that's humiliating, it's not that God is sending it as a kind of like, I'm doing this in order to humble you. It is more like we're like coming to the realization that we're stuck in, to Zizek's in the movie about him, he says, we are dreaming the wrong dreams. And there's something to that. We're desiring the wrong thing. And the discovery of the brokenness is actually the cross. And in that, we have a chance. This is why it's hard for the rich man to enter through the eye of a needle, because if you're successful, you don't really get the chance to know the ways in which you're deeply wounded and misdirected. And in discovering your mess, that is like the great chance for Jesus. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? To really have Jesus come into your life. And if you want to know what's happening in the world, we have this thing called the preferential option for the poor, which is spoken to the rich. But if you're poor, you already know you're a mess. Like, the only people who don't know they're a mess are the people who are successful. But if you're poor, if you want to know what the world's really like, be in the out group. That is what the world is really like. And that then is the way into entering into Jesus. That's what's always going on. They just are the ones who are forced to be aware of it.
Yeah, that's the poverty of spirit. That's the Beatitudes, that there's no presumption. And of course, what we need to end on a positive note. And then what you discover is the peace and the love of Jesus that comes into your heart. You can actually be at peace with the world. You can be at peace with yourself. And the people that, may have been your all-consuming enemy, oh, well, you recognize the trivialities of, their lives have been consumed by this thing that we're describing. And in a way, then you're bigger than those situations. And so you're able to enjoy the peace of Jesus. You're able to enjoy other people, the love of Christ. And that's the happy ending to this, that the dark night of the soul then awakens you to the realities of the morning, that the sun, the light breaks through, and the things that you may have been all consuming to you emotionally, psychologically, personally, it just is put in its place, and you realize that I don't need to live my life with this futility. I can live my life on this side of heaven already enjoying the qualities of, life with Christ.
That's a beautiful note to end on. I appreciate your helping us through your blog post for those of us who are not inclined to sit down and work through something written.
Try better.
No, this is not about you. This is about me. It's all about me, right? I'm still in pride.
All right,
well, thank you, Paul.
Look at Genesis chapter 4, verse 3 to 10. So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part, also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering, but for Cain and for his offering he had no regard. So Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it." Cain told Abel, his brother, and it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" And he said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" He said, "What have you done?" "The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." And so here we have the themes of sacrifice, jealousy, murder. But what I want to focus on is that we actually hear in this verse, in this section, is the first use of the word sin in the Bible. In many ways, of course, this is a kind of repeat of the fall. Now God asks after Abel, and of course Cain is the liar. The serpent does not appear, but actually sin does the same work. The word here is the Hebrew is translated in the Septuagint into the Greek, and the word here is hamartia in the Septuagint. And it is in God's warning, prior to his slaying of Abel, that we have the word sin. God says, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. Hamartia, or sin, means missing the mark. But of course, what is the mark? What is the target? Well, obviously it's God. But in this passage, it's interesting. God equates sin with this same animate, desiring force, like that of the serpent, that can and of course will gain mastery over Cain. And so sin, it takes on this animate quality. It's crouching. It's seeming to speak. It's seeming to desire. It's lying in the serpent or the devil and tries to disrupt the relation between God and man. So sin, maybe we use the word Satan, but actually maybe we should just call it the Satan, the adversary, the subpersonal force at work here, causes enmity. You know, we have other places in the Bible where God sends an angel. You remember the story to Balaam. Balaam's hitting his donkey, and God sends an angel, and it's called the Satan. But of course, it's not referring even to the angel. It's just this work that the adversary is doing. Also, we have the case of Joshua the high priest being confronted, and it's obviously not, this diabolical character. So more often, sin or the devil, it's just this force, the one who separates the enemy, the liar, the seducer. And this force is a malicious, lying force aiming to create enmity and separation from God. And so the missing of the mark becomes obvious. In the fall, the serpent points to obtaining knowledge and the tree of knowledge of good and evil, pointing away to that tree from the tree of life representing God. This is sin. This is what sin does. It obscures God. And in acting on this lie, the first couple are cast out of the garden. And notice in this text, the focus is on the shift in desire. Both Cain and then in the case of Adam and Eve, they move from desiring life with God, the tree of life, to desiring the other tree. It says in Genesis 3:6, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from it and ate and gave to her husband. And so Adam and Eve, in rejecting the model of God. Now here's the key point. What is sin? Sin is missing the mark. Sin is missing the target. And of course, what happens in 5:1 of Genesis, it says, he made him in the likeness of God. Then skip down 2 verses. In 5:3, it says, when Adam lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his own likeness, according to his image. That is, we've lost the model, we've lost the target, we've lost the mark. There's a moral failure in this kind of self-modeling, and this is the story. There is Cain to Lamech to the generation of Noah. There is this slide into being totally separated from God. And the picture is that corruption then involves a displacement of the model, of the mark, of the target. As Cain turns his jealous attention off of God onto Abel, as Lamech is filled with revenge and focused on his enemies, as the generation of Noah turned on one another and away from God. It says in 6:5, every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So the focus off God, onto the parent, onto the brother, the enemy, it creates a kind of exponential desire and violence. 6:11 says, now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. So the target indicated in hamartia that poses itself in sin is a false goal based on a deadly deception. And this then is the understanding, this is the thematic. The mark or goal is never external to God. But in sin, the target is obscured. As Isaiah says in Isaiah 59:2, your iniquities have separated you from your God, your sins have hidden his face from you so that he will not hear. Now, I had heard this my whole life. The preacher gets up and says, sin is missing the mark. But I don't think I had put it together. Yes, it's missing the desired mark, but the mark is not only obscured, but displaced by what is actually unachievable. The knowledge of good and evil, which would make you gods, displaces knowing God. And so there's this exponential desire. In Genesis 4, the sacrifice of the brother Abel by Cain so as to attain the place of favor, the focus is on his brother. And of course that's not going to work. He doesn't gain God's favor. They don't become like God in Genesis. In the story of Lamech, if Cain would be revenged 7 times, I'll revenge myself. So the focus is on the enemy. That is, there's the missing of the mark, but I think we often think of this missing of the mark in some sort of legal sense. And that's not what's being described. In each instance, an obstacle, sin, Satan, a lie, obscures God. And knowing God, finding favor with God, justice, these are all good goals, but they're obscured, they're displaced. And this then is what becomes clear in the New Testament in regard to the law. The law is an obstacle. So we're not thinking of missing the mark in terms of the law. The missing of the mark, in fact, is caused in part because the law becomes an obstacle. And so the New Testament clarifies the nature of the deception and the hostility it creates. There's a complete transformation in the New Testament use, same word, hamartia, to denote that there is hostility to God. And this is what Jesus makes clear. People's reaction to Jesus is their reaction, in fact, to God. But now things have changed. In times past, your sins were not counted against you. But with Christ, there is culpability. He says in John 15:21, if I had not come and spoken to them, they would not be guilty of sin. But now they have no excuse for their sin. Jesus exposes the murderous intent of the scribes and Pharisees, maybe not because they're peculiarly bad people. Maybe, in fact, they're the best of people. But what the best of people would do when they meet Jesus is kill him. Maybe in a fatal case of mistaken identity. This is Dietrich Bonhoeffer says, when a human being confronts Jesus, either the human being must die or they kill Jesus. And so the I, the ego, the false goal. Jesus is unambiguous. Either the false self dies, this false self given over to sin, or one joins in the impetus of the murder, the impetus behind the murder of Christ. Maybe this comes out clearly. Look at Matthew 23. And in the midst of their plotting to kill Jesus, the leading Jews are deceived about their violence. They say in 23:30, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. They know their forefathers were deceived and killed the prophets, but of course they can't see their own delusion. And Jesus makes this obvious in 23:31 to 32. You testify against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets, because you can't see your own delusion. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers. They're plotting to kill Jesus. And that's just what their forefathers had done with the prophets. They are deceived killers. And Jesus exposes this reality in verse 27. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and uncleanness. Luke says the same thing. He says, they are like unmarked graves that men unwittingly walk over. And I think the picture is, the danger is, it's a kind of trap you might fall into. The corruption is hidden in the facade, but the intent is clear. And of course, they're already plotting right after this. Jesus says, you're planning to kill me. They said, no, we're not. The next verse down it says, and they begin to plot to kill Jesus. And in this verse, in 23, look at verse 35. I think this is key. The history of murder is now revealed, and Jesus' persecutors are culpable. He says, upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. So here's the first murder, that of Cain, that we read about. The last murder in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Old Testament. But all the murders in the history of the earth are now exposed. You're guilty. The image of God, obscured by sin, is fully revealed in Christ. Right? So the mark, the target, is now clear. What do? Because of their sin, they would destroy the true image so as to preserve the obstacle, the false image. You know, it's sort of the story in Mark 12 of the evil wine growers and the owner of the vineyard sending the servants and then finally sending his son, whom they killed in order to gain ownership. Israel, as a nation, is committed to murder and has always been dominated by the same deadly spirit, Jesus says. The blood of all the prophets shed since the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation. Jews are the prime example, not of simply a Jewish problem, but of a universal problem. But it is exposed in them, the spirit of murder, the history of murder and violence, which would take by force the life that is freely given. And so their intent is exposed in their killing of the Messiah. You know, in Mark it talks about the destruction of Israel. The absolute destruction, you know, that we know. The temple is destroyed, Jerusalem is destroyed. And actually when we're saying that, what we're saying is the Jewish religion is destroyed. In Mark 13, 7-8, when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be frightened. He's saying this cataclysmic violence that is coming upon Israel is coming upon the world. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will also be famines. These things are merely the beginning of birth pains. So Jesus describes war and violence. It's not the instrument of God, but it's the culmination of evil. And the violence on display against him, culminating in the destruction of Jerusalem, and then a world conflagration. He describes in Mark 13:12, brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child, and children will rise up against parents and have them put to death. Jesus is the beginning of the end. We're in the end times. You know, we talk about the end times. Well, the end times begin with the ministry of Christ. And this violence is marking the end. And so when Jesus accuses the scribes and Pharisees of this murderous opposition, theirs is simply a type of the violence which will ultimately infect the world in its pursuit of life through death. And so Judaism and the law do not save from sin, but the law is the characteristic obstruction to God. The law, this is this teaching in the New Testament. The law becomes an end or goal in itself. It becomes the thing seeming to hold out life, and there is no life in the law, Paul says. In Romans 7:7, there's this confusion. Is the law sin? That is, there's confusion in sin trying to obtain life through law that makes it seem that the problem is with the law. But the problem is the goal is confused. The law is confused with the goal. The law becomes a target in and of itself. The law is not the target. The law is not God. The law is not the power of God. The law is not the presence of God. The law does not contain life. But to imagine that it does creates the impossible situation of making the law the goal that characterizes sin. You missed the target, which in Paul's explanation points to the purpose of the law. In Romans 5:20, he said, the law came in so that transgression would increase. Now, Paul does his own commentary on the story of the fall in Romans 7. There's no serpent in Paul's depiction, but here's the way he describes it in 7:8. Sin taking the opportunity through the law produced in me coveting of every kind. In 7:9, sin became alive. There's this animate force. In 7:11, sin taking an opportunity through the commandment deceived me, and through it killed me. It's doing everything that this serpent was, but Paul's just saying, well, that's just sin. Sin's deception creates this unobtainable goal, kind of the big other, the false God, that which our desire is set on, that is ultimately inherently unobtainable. Now, in the light of Christ, Hebrews 1:3 says, the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of his nature. Here is the target. Here is the true image. What's the target? Becoming like God, becoming like Christ. This is made a reality. The deception is exposed in Christ because here is the true target. The possibility of defeating sin. In Hebrews 3:13, encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today. Here's our Sabbath verse, by the way. Enter into this Sabbath rest. Every day is the day of Sabbath, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. Maybe this is the story, the characteristic story of the New Testament, the story of the prodigal son. He wants the money. He doesn't want the father, he wants the father's money, and he goes to a far country, spends it all, and then he repents and he says, I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. And so the son's prodigal action, he abandons his father. There's the sin, that's clear. But the parable illustrates Jesus' understanding that sin is to betray the father for this false reality. It is going out from the father's house, remoteness from God. And the event achieved through the coming of Jesus is recovery of the father, recovery of the target. In Christ, we recognize the true image of God, and we can thus be victorious over the deluding effect of sin that causes us to miss the mark. Now, I'm saying all this is kind of a new discovery for me. I don't think I understood the profound nature of this idea of sin being missing the mark. Actually, sin is one of the most complicated concepts in the Bible, and we tend to reduce it in modern preaching and teaching to just, oh, you break the law, you're guilty, and Jesus came and he solves your guilt problem. But actually in the Hebrew especially, the original context, it's such a variety of words. And to reduce it to just the judicial or legal misses this variety of Hebrew concepts that unfortunately in the Septuagint gets translated into one word, hamartia, sin. So it can involve a misdemeanor, it can involve negligence, it can say, it may be to bend, to go astray, to miss the point, to fail to find what you're seeking, to miss the way. So that sin equated with guilt is not there in the Old Testament. Sometimes it is, but sometimes there's no moral culpability at all. So we cannot simply make sin this legal guilt thing. But sin, as I've described it today, as missing the mark or failing to achieve a desired end. I think this gets it. But to reduce it to a judicial sense, it misses the full relational, emotional, the desiring connotation of the biblical word and the context. The judicial understanding imagines that the desired end is in view. And what I've been saying is that misses the biblical notion that sin deceives through an obscured goal, a desire that obscures and lies. And we don't even have the mark or the target in sight. There is a broken relationship as the lie of sin directs desire onto an unobtainable object. Eve is focused on the fruit. Cain is focused on his brother. The prodigal son wants his inheritance. He's focused on that. The older son is focused on his brother. The Pharisee is focused on the law. And each instance then is an illustration that God as the goal is obscured. And this then explains that in Christ, the root of sin is exposed. There's this obscuring, animating lie. This is exposed. And the target we are aiming at is clear in Christ. The image of God, the very image of God, our goal and purpose is set before us. And sin is defeated.
Forging Plowshares is a community dedicated to cultivating the peaceful kingdom by providing in-depth, transformative biblical and theological education and discipleship. If you have found this podcast valuable, please remember to share on social media. If you have questions about what you've heard, or if you'd like to learn more about how you can get involved with Forging Plowshares or even support this ministry financially, please visit our website, forgingplowshares.org.